This is an island surrounded by water, big water, ocean water. Trust me, I'm like a smart person. I'm very consistent. I'm a very stable genius. I had the best words. Tolerated. I know words. Mike Pounds. I hope they now go and take a look at the oranges of the investigation. But there's no better word than stupid. Anonymous, really anonymous. I'm very highly educated. One of the wettest we've ever seen from the standpoint of water. Had the best words. God bless the United States.
Around the nation, UIT Nation, Jeff Waldorf here with you. Welcome to the show. We got a great show here for you guys today. We're going to talk about a bunch of different stories related, of course, to coronavirus. We get those updates on some stories. Man, not looking good today. So, it as usual, as you guys point out, it's just another disastrous day in America. We have the Texas governor basically admitting that it's going to be a bloodbath, reopening the state. We've got the Corona Task Force that is coming to an end for some reason. Not only that, but we have, of course, a whistleblower complaint related to corruption within the Trump administration. I can't wait to get to that story. And Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, has a new plan to punish the real culprits behind COVID-19, the Chinese. Yeah. So we have those stories. We also have an update on the New York Democratic primary. So that's interesting. So we'll get to that later on in the show. But first, please like and share the stream if you haven't already. Very helpful if you do. Also, earlier today, I was in the Benjamin Dixon show. So we had a discussion about radicalization, mainly the radicalization of ourselves, away from, I don't know if I really say away from the Democratic Party, but yeah, it kind of looks that way because the Democratic Party has shown that it is basically bankrupt and wants to shut down any sort of progressive. And so they would rather have a progressive lose and have a Donald Trump win, basically, than have a progressive win. So they'd rather have that. It was a good discussion. I talked with him for about a half hour. Some of that, of course, ended up on his Patreon feed. So if you're a patron of Ben Dixon, and you'll enjoy that conversation. It was a great conversation. I do enjoy speaking with other hosts, so I plan to do that more often. And check that out if you haven't already. It was a great discussion. But we have a great show ready for you guys today, so I guess we should just dive into it. All right. As the coronavirus continues to hammer the country and the economy, President Trump is focused on the real issues, painting his border wall. Now, the Washington Post is reporting that Trump has ordered contractors to go and paint new and replacement wall. He's going to paint them. He wants them to be let's start that again. As coronavirus hammers the country and the economy, President Trump is focused on the real issue that is painting his border wall. Washington Post is reporting that Trump has ordered contractors to go and paint new and replacement wall and to paint it black, specifically flat black. Why flat black, you ask? It's something that Donald Trump had specifically requested that he do, and he would not be denied. Despite an earlier report that Trump's commanders and border officials had finally talked him out of it, here he is again ordering the government to spend millions of dollars in painting his wall a ridiculous color. Now, painting the wall black is going to cost American taxpayers a minimum of $500 million. Estimates range from $1.2 million per mile for 2 coats of acrylic paint to $4.5 million per mile for military-grade epoxy. That's coating and sealant, to $6.8 million per mile for black powder coating. The reason, of course, he says is if it's black, then it gets hotter and it's harder to climb. Well, look, climbing isn't exactly the issue when it comes to a wall. People have been able to saw their way through those bars with $20 to $30 hand saws. Not only that, people can dig under the wall, as we've discovered many tunnels going under the border. You also have people catapulting drugs over the border. So really, border wall, essentially useless. And yet, here we are in the middle of a pandemic in which many people are deciding not to travel anyway for their own safety, painting a wall or paying people to paint a wall with taxpayer money that could be used to go to coronavirus relief, of course. And look, border officials have considered the black paint to be completely unnecessary, costly, and a significant long-term maintenance burden. All of those, of course, could also describe the current resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Just saying. That, of course, facts, logic, reason, cost, the current situation, none of that will deter President Trump from completing his vanity project. Because at the end of the day, of course, it's all he has. The economy is in shambles. 70,000 people are dead. 30 million have applied for unemployment. It's all as a result of the pandemic that he ignored. His approval ratings are in the garbage, even as many of his base still continue to hold on and deny reality. The only glimmer of hope for his reelection rests in the Democrats putting an even worse choice up. And they, of course, have been working very hard at doing so. We'll find out if even Joe Biden is enough to sink the Democrats, even compared to this terrible president. This is a desperate move, of course, by a president who is at the same time very easily distracted and searching for any kind of political win. A little bit of red meat to throw to an increasingly cooped up and agitated base. All right. Moving on.
How do we know reopening businesses won't result in faster spread or more cases of COVID-19? Listen, the fact of the matter is pretty much every scientific and medical report shows that whenever you have a reopening, whether you want to call it a reopening of business or just a reopening of society in the aftermath of something like this, that actually will lead to an increase in spreads. It's almost ipso facto. The more that you have people out there, the greater the possibility there is for transmission.
That was, of course, Republican Governor Greg Abbott admitting the truth, of course, to a closed session. Now, Abbott, of course, whose state of Texas now has for 34,000 documented cases of coronavirus and probably many more that are undetected due to the lack of testing, and has lost nearly 1,000 citizens to the disease already, has been more than antsy to begin reopening his economy. Texas is, of course, one of the several states taking steps to reopen their businesses, even as public health experts warn of a massive surge in COVID-19 deaths if the states are reopened. Georgia is another one of those states that has already seen a spike in coronavirus cases. Internal CDC documents or projections that emerged earlier this week show the nationwide coronavirus death toll could double to 3,000 people a day by June 1st. Think about that. That is one 9/11 every 24 hours. The following 9/11, of course, everyone was required to remove their shoes if they want to board a plane and to accept permanent infringements upon their rights and their privacy. And a lot of people did so with nary a peep from those who are now showing up to state houses armed with semi-automatic rifles. I suppose giving up those rights in order to fight the terrorists is far more palatable than temporarily staying indoors or wearing a mask out in public. Social distancing is apparently how the terrorists win. It's more incredible with the recent calls from conservatives to sacrifice the weak, the elderly, and the infirm at the slightest inconvenience. For example, we have former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie saying that we have to accept that there will be many more deaths as a result of reopening the economy.
Of course, everybody wants to save every life they can. But the question is, towards what end ultimately? Are there ways that we can thread the middle here to allow that there are going to be deaths, and they're going to be deaths no matter what? And if we can do things to keep people in the mode of wearing masks, of wearing gloves, of distancing where appropriate, we've got to let some of these folks get back to work, because if we don't, we're going to destroy the American way of life in these families, and it will be years and years before we can recover.
All lives matter? Debatable. Pro-life? Perhaps not so much. Death panels? Apparently all for them. The complete hypocrisy of Republican politicians and conservative talk show hosts, who, like myself, are actually privileged enough to be able to do our jobs from home. So we, of course, don't face the actual hardships from losing our income. That hypocrisy is on full display when they call to sacrifice you for the economy. Many of the protesters, of course, that are calling for the people to get back to work are not working people. They're the business owners. They're the business class. They want you to get back to work for them. They want their employees to come back and begin making them profit. Or, on the other hand, you see, of course, people that want services. Karen wants a haircut. Well, you have to come back to work if you're a hairdresser for their convenience and possibly expose yourself to COVID-19. They want to sit at a diner and be served lunch. Well, that requires you, if you're a server, to come back into work. And again, risk yourself, risk your own health for their own convenience. The risk here is for the workers, who cannot simply leave if somebody decides not to adhere to social distancing or wear a mask. They're a paying customer, and in America, the customer is always right, as long as they have money. Along with these efforts to reopen, you have unscrupulous politicians who begin to cut off unemployment benefits to those who would normally qualify for them under these extreme measures. The same aforementioned workers, of course, are then faced with a false choice: return to work, be exposed, or not be able to pay your bills. And then what happens to your family? You can't buy food, you can't buy medicine, you no longer have your employer-sponsored health insurance. What now? These bills, they do not stop because no politician has stopped them. There was the chance to be able to pass a way for us to freeze rents and mortgages. The banks were bailed out with trillions of taxpayer dollars. And of course, those same banks who hold the majority of mortgages are able to go and continue to collect on those mortgages, which allows, of course, those people who are paying the mortgages, the apartment owners, or the homeowners that rent out to continue collecting rents. It has not stopped. Credit card collection is still going on. There are some options for deferment, but really, deferring your payments is not the same as freezing your payments. Deferring those payments often leads to a higher payment once they resume. Not very helpful. These same politicians who fought to stop unemployment benefits also blocked efforts to freeze rents and mortgages to make sure that the bills continue to come and to make sure that your reliance on this income is there so that you will be ready and desperate enough to return to work without any fuss. Senator Lindsey Graham is a great example to this because he argued that unemployment should be extended over his, quote, dead body.
What have we learned? If you pay people $23 an hour not to work, they will take you up on it. It doesn't mean they're lazy. It means if you're going to pay them $23 not to work, they'll probably take that over $17 to go to work, even though people like working. So July the 31st is when this expires, and I promise you, over our dead bodies, this will get reauthorized. We've got to stop this. You cannot turn on the economy until you get this aberration in the law fixed.
The aberration he's speaking of course, is extended unemployment benefits, an extra $600 on top of the normal state benefit. Many of the states, of course, opening up, have rules that say that you cannot refuse a job so that if you are called back to work, you no longer get that benefit. Now, Lindsey Graham, of course, he says over his dead body. What about the bodies of the thousands of people who will die once these rules are relaxed? Again, the doubling of the death toll will happen, according to projections, by June 1st, leading to 3,000 people a day. Lindsey Graham does not care about them. His opposition is paying those very people at risk to stay home to mitigate that risk. He would rather they go out and risk themselves. For Lindsey Graham, is not at risk at all. Greg Abbott also admitting there will be a lot of death, and yet they're also admitting that they're more than willing to make you their latest sacrifice for their convenience. Never have we seen a party so callous in its actions when it comes to real human lives versus the health of their investment portfolios and revenue spreadsheets. They will choose the intangible versus the very real, and that, of course, is real human lives. The remarks by the governor only go to prove that they know exactly what they're asking. All right. Despite calls by scientists and experts in mounting deaths due to COVID-19, the president has decided to declare victory and end efforts to contain the virus. Now, the president, during a recent press conference in Arizona, basically laid out the reasons and laid it out very plainly that Americans must die to reopen the economy.
Well, now it's time to open it up. And you know what? The people of our country are warriors, and I'm looking at it. I'm not saying anything is perfect, and yes, will some people be affected? Yes. Will some people be affected badly? Yes. But we have to get our country open, and we have to get it open soon.
Will some people be affected? Yes. Will some people be badly affected? Yes. The numbers of those affected, of course, will be stark. It's estimated that over 3,000 people a day will die by June 1st. That number, of course, would be doubled as states begin to open up. Nonetheless, the president is taking the actions to ensure that the numbers of the dead and infected will rise rapidly instead of decrease. In fact, Trump's coronavirus task force is beginning to wind down. This is according to Vice President Mike Pence. Operations, he say, are expected to conclude by June 1st. So it is the same date, of course, that we're expected to hit double the current death rate. Seems like they've already made their decision to allow the virus to run rampant across the country and ensure that as many people as possible become exposed and overwhelm our healthcare system. It's not unlike what Sweden had done at the beginning. To force herd immunity, the Swedish government decided to keep life as normal as possible. The result, of course, unsurprisingly, was a high death toll for a very small European nation. That plan, according to Swedish officials, was to allow healthy people to continue functioning in society while sheltering the old and sick, and counting on citizens to socially distance themselves without any sort of rules or lockdowns. Now, they kept, of course, people in nursing homes, the elderly, safe by barring visitors. However, unfortunately, nearly half of all the deaths that happened in nursing homes. State epidemiologist Anders Tegnell had told The Daily Show with Trevor Noah that health officials thought it would be easier to keep the disease away from those people if they were sequestered in their homes. Well, that obviously failed, as Tegnell admitted that they didn't realize the true risk of the virus. He said, quote, "We never really calculated the high death toll initially. I must say the death toll really came as a surprise to us." Now, that appears to be the plan of the Trump administration, to release the lockdowns all over the country and count on citizens to, of course, just do the right thing. Personal responsibility, they say. You should know better. You should take it upon yourself to wear a mask. Maybe. You should take it upon yourself to socially distance when applicable. Except the country's leaders have not been leading on this issue. Earlier today, Donald Trump was doing a tour of a Honeywell factory where they were producing masks. Did the president wear a mask? No, he did not. Earlier still, you had Vice President Mike Pence doing a tour of the Mayo Clinic, in which he also had not been wearing a mask. Now, that mask is not to protect Pence. The mask is not to protect Trump, but it is to protect others from contracting the virus from someone who may be an asymptomatic spreader. That is the reason why people are asked to wear masks. People are asked to wear masks in Michigan, where I'm located, although it is not a ticketable offense. A lot of the protesters that protest against Gretchen Whitmer's tyranny seem to have missed that point. Nonetheless, here we see the entire plan of Republicans is to let this thing play out and continue to get people back to work. In many states, we have seen, after they have released their lockdowns, an increase in confirmed coronavirus cases and an increase in deaths. Now, the president, business owners, and Republican politicians, media figures as well, seem to be okay with this mass death scenario. Many saying that, of course, the deaths are necessary to avoid an even worse economic disaster. Now, there's no doubt that people are suffering economically. Small business owners, and with them, I understand their fears. I understand the fact that they are suffering. The latest coronavirus deal, they got the shorter end of the stick, as well as most American citizens, while corporations and the very wealthy ended up getting the lion's share of the coronavirus relief. Trillions upon trillions of dollars handed out to the banks and the biggest companies. Now, that said, it is the government's job to provide the people in need. And right now, there are a lot of people in need. However, according to conservative politicians, well, those people shouldn't count on the government to help them whatsoever because it's not the government's job. What's funny is that many of these conservative politicians who accepted the fact that we did give these unemployment benefits and a one-time $1,200 check to a select few million of Americans, well, they only accepted it because there was a large bailout for their donors. The other reason, of course, that they oppose this and that they're virulently opposed to giving any more sort of aid in a, for example, phase 4 stimulus that would help the states is the fact that they are afraid that a small taste of socialism might sour them in the poison Kool-Aid that they have been given for decades. Low wages, no benefits, busted unions. They approved the so-called CARES Act because their donors benefited, but when it comes to bailing out the people, well, this seems to be their response. Mitch McConnell had told reporters at a presser that they were in absolutely no hurry to pass a phase 4 stimulus bill as well, and they're, of course, unsure that there even will be one. There's, of course, some discussions in Congress whether or not to do this and what would be involved. However, one thing that they would want involved, if they're able to do this, or if they even want to, is a way to benefit, once again, corporations. In fact, one of the things that they said is that they wanted to make sure to protect, to give blanket immunity to any company whose employees fall sick to coronavirus, meaning that they do not have to protect their employees by practicing social distancing or ensuring that employees are able to practice social distancing, or the fact that they don't have to give any sort of PPE, masks, gloves, etc. That, of course, is another huge bailout. Going back to those who are looking to not do anything about this, you had economic advisor Larry Kudlow saying that we're in a pause period when it comes to any new plans to pass the stimulus. He told CNN's Jake Tapper that, quote, "We have put up $3 trillion of direct federal budget assistance in one way or another. The Federal Reserve has actually put in as much as $4 trillion to $6 trillion, so it's a huge, huge package. Let's see how it's doing as we gradually reopen the economy." Of course, that vast majority of money went to corporations and not people. And so it turns out the real plan is to sacrifice American citizens to the markets by depriving people of basic government aid. The type of aid that many countries are providing in the form of a temporary UBI, generous unemployment benefits, and rigorous social distancing requirements. Measures that in America are unthinkable to the ruling class. The very people most at risk not at risk are the ones telling you that you must take the most risk. The end of the coronavirus task force with the removal of the last vestige of government accountability of this virus. When a second wave inevitably hits, and it will hit, the country will again be blindsided, and with no protections in place, will be in an even more dire situation than any conservative pundit could ever imagine. We've not even hit peak, but now it seems rather assured that we as a country will soon hit bottom. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to come back. We have some news about the Democratic Party, and then whistleblower complaint, as well as Senator Blackburn goes after China. So we've got that coming up next. Stay right here around the nation.
Mike Pounds.
Welcome back to the show. Around the Nation right here, TWT Nation. Jeff Waldorf here with you. All right, so we have a couple of super chats here. Adrian Benningfield says, terrorists are winning via conservative policies. Considering how many of the terrorists are conservative, yes, you have a point. If it means, of course, the eventual erosion of some of the freedoms that we take for, that I guess we took for granted for a while, freedom of privacy, all that stuff, etc., then yes, it seems to be that we have an issue where the extreme right is winning. Now, David Richardson says, I might not be able to get a haircut yet, but at least I can enjoy freshly made pizza in the park. Got to defend New Zealand. So New Zealand is an example of a country that has dealt with this incredibly well. So you have a situation where essentially, according to the New Zealand government, they've eliminated coronavirus from New Zealand. But even though they say they have done that, they still say practice social distancing. So that is pretty important. So they're still being incredibly cautious. Whereas here in America, look, 75% of Americans are fine with the stay-at-home orders. They say, yes, we're okay with staying at home. Yes, even if it causes economic harm. So the majority of American citizens are responsible. Problem with one of these viruses that is incredibly contagious, more contagious than, for example, the flu, more contagious than mainly anything that we've seen as of recently. Well, it only takes one person or a couple of people who are not practicing social distancing or doing the stuff that you're supposed to do to infect a large number of people. So that's a problem. All right. Ronnie Lama Richardson says, here's to you for all you do. Thank you. I do appreciate that. You guys help me run the show. You keep us sustainable and healthy. All right. So that said, let's do an update here on the Democratic primary. We have an update on the upcoming canceled Democratic primary. It has now been uncanceled. Apparently, the state of New York will conduct its primary as it was supposed to on June 23rd. So now it was supposed to actually take place on April 28th, but because of fears of the coronavirus, it had been moved up to June 23rd and then had been canceled, citing coronavirus fears. Now, I talked about this in another segment, the fact that New York could be doing vote by mail. Vote by mail is not only safe, but also an effective way to vote. Soldiers use it in order to cast their ballots. Why can't the rest of us use it? Nonetheless, it was canceled after Bernie Sanders had suspended his campaign. Now, suspended his campaign, he could also unsuspend his campaign, but that really depends on him. Nonetheless, he said that he wanted to remain on the ballot in order to continue collecting delegates. Now, delegates are very, very important, as there is a threshold of delegates, 25%, in order to get some of your people, your delegates, onto important delegate committees during the convention. That's why we saw some changes go into effect at the last convention, and also the formation of a unity commission. I had a friend, Nomiki Konst, that served on the DNC Reform Unity Commission, and they won several small concessions from the Democratic establishment. The prevention here, the hope from the establishment this time, is to prevent such a thing from happening again, especially as we've seen the success of the Democratic Party in California Democratic activists or progressive activists had taken over that local Democratic Party, and you had seen a gigantic win for Bernie Sanders in California. So they wish to prevent any sort of takeover of the rules. And the reason, of course, is that they want the DNC to continue serving the donors because the donors give them money. Nonetheless, this is a great decision. And it actually was brought about by someone who was unexpected, Andrew Yang. So now, an injunction granted by U.S. District Judge Annalisa Torres came in response to a lawsuit from former presidential candidate and CNN contributor Andrew Yang and several New Yorkers who had hoped to serve as delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Yang, in a statement, said, "I'm glad that a federal judge agreed that depriving millions of New Yorkers of the right to vote was wrong. I hope that the New York Board of Elections takes from this ruling a newfound appreciation of their role in safeguarding our democracy. The New York Board of Elections must reinstate to the Democratic primary ballot those presidential and delegate candidates who were duly qualified as of April 26, 2020, and to hold the primary election on June 23rd, 2020, the ruling said. The New York State Board of Elections declined to comment at the ruling Tuesday night. In a ruling, Torres wrote that Yang and the would-be delegates had, quote, made a clear and substantial showing of likelihood of success and the merits of their claim that the action by the Democrats and the state board had violated their constitutional rights. So, of course, the state board used coronavirus as an excuse to try to shut down the primary. Look, they say that nobody being on the ballot, or I should say nobody actually running an effective campaign, meant that we're not going to send people out to risk themselves in an election. But again, as I mentioned before, there are other options. There's, again, mail-in ballots, which are very, very effective when it comes to a pandemic. However, a lot of conservative politicians are against vote by mail. They say that it's insecure and leads to voter fraud, which I think that if it's good enough for our soldiers, it should be good enough for everyone else. Donald Trump had actually admitted the real reason why he didn't like mail-in ballots. It's because he says if he did, no Republican would ever get elected again. Now, he does say that's because of so-called fraud, but it turns out that vote by mail is actually incredibly effective and incredibly safe and secure and a good way to vote. So, doesn't exactly hold a lot of water. I think this is a great decision. I think that this is good for democracy. Millions of Americans now get to have their voices heard. We know that Bernie Sanders, of course, is not going to win this primary, but he should have all the representation that is due to him from the people's votes. If they feel strongly enough or want him to hit that 25% threshold, they should be allowed to vote because, again, that is their right under the Constitution. I think it's a good decision. I support this decision, and I think Ms. Torres ruled in the right way. I look forward to seeing the results of this primary election, as well as the results of hopefully the rest of the country, who has now over 20 contests still to go in this presidential primary. All right. Moving on. Thank you, by the way, Obrera 13, ILWU Local 13 in the house. Union member. Awesome. All right. There's a new explosive whistleblower complaint out against the Trump administration. Dr. Rick Bright, an immunology expert. I have a hard time with that word. Dr. Rick Bright, an immunology expert, and until last month, the director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, also known as BARDA, claims that he was fired in retaliation for objecting to a treatment hawked by the president. That in itself is, I think, an incredible scandal, as we know that this medicine, hydroxychloroquine, so-called miracle drug for COVID-19, was neither a miracle treatment nor a treatment at all for coronavirus. In fact, the treatment was often ineffective and even dangerous in some circumstances, as it created cardiovascular failure in certain patients. Now, punishing Dr. Bright for rightly raising the alarm about this unproven drug was just one of his unacceptable acts of defiance. Dr. Bright said, in addition to retaliation for objecting to President Trump's insistence that hydroxychloroquine was effective at treating COVID-19, when we absolutely had no indications at all that that was the case, he also faced sustained pressure from HHS officials since the beginning of the Trump administration to steer millions of dollars in contracts to the client of lobbyist John Clerici. Clerici has a long-standing connection to Dr. Robert Kadlec, Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS, according to the complaint. Dr. Bright complains that multiple times, beginning in 2017 when Trump took office, he was pressured to extend government contracts to Aeolus Pharmaceuticals, happens to be a client of Dr. Clerici's. In addition to being his client, Aeolus' CEO was a friend of Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor. Bright refused to extend that contract, leading to discord between him and his superiors at the department. That tension grew steadily as Kadlec and other officials urged Bright to transfer $40 million from BARDA to the Strategic National Stockpile in 2018 to purchase a drug made by manufacturer Alvogen, another of Clerici's clients, among other disagreements. According to the complaint, Dr. Kadlec's frustration with and animus towards Dr. Bright reached its breaking point when, after the emergence of COVID-19, Dr. Bright resisted efforts to fall into line with the administration's directive to promote the broad use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine and to award lucrative contracts for these and other drugs, even though they lacked scientific merit, had not received prior scientific vetting. It's important to note that hydroxychloroquine is a drug used for malaria and also for patients with certain immunodisorders. The use of hydroxychloroquine in many of these testing for resistance to, or I should say, to fight COVID-19 coronavirus, ended up with many patients who use the drug, who need the drug, to not have access to that drug. Now, we also found out that Trump had a small financial stake in one of the companies involved in the manufacture of hydroxychloroquine, as did others in his inner circle. Bright also wrote in his 89-page complaint that he encountered pushback in January when he called on HHS to begin developing resources in preparation for treatment and vaccine research as the COVID-19 pandemic reached the United States. It was clear to Dr. Bright almost immediately, according to the complaint, that the virus was highly contagious, spreading rapidly, and could have a high mortality rate. Bright and his staff recognized the urgent need to obtain genetic sequencing information about the virus and to acquire viruses and clinical specimens from people infected with the virus to share with laboratories and companies. Dr. Bright encountered indifference which then developed into hostility from HH leadership, including Secretary Alex Azar, as Dr. Bright and his staff raised concerns about the virus and the urgent need to act. The department leadership also then grew increasingly hostile towards Bright after he communicated with members of Congress, the press, and some White House officials, including trade advisor Peter Navarro, about the need to act urgently to combat the pandemic. Peter Navarro, of course, talked about this, had presented the White House with stacks and stacks of paper in order to show the deadliness of this disease. Now, CNN reported now that Bright is scheduled to testify to Congress as early as next week on the charges included in his complaint. Now, there are other people that are not allowed to testify in front of Congress. That includes Dr. Fauci, which is part of the now soon to be disbanded coronavirus task force. So now, here in this case, we have a clear case of the administration not only ignoring the potential lethality of the virus, but also punishing and demoting those who happen to raise the alarms about the virus. Add into the allegation that he was pressured to reward companies connected to those in the administration, and you have a great example of the swamp behavior that Donald Trump had claimed that he was going to fight against. Swamp, of course, is alive and well, thriving under Trump's leadership, or lack thereof. Another gross example of ignoring science, factual information, in order to basically only help themselves and their very well-connected friends. Okay. One more. As the cases and deaths from the coronavirus pandemic are expected to increase, millions more file for unemployment, 30 million already, Tennessee's Republican senator is focusing on what she believes really matters: punishing China. Now, Senator Marsha Blackburn is now introducing a bill called the Stop COVID Act, which neither stops COVID or does anything related to stopping COVID. And this bill, the heart of it, aims to make China pay literally for their role in the spread of coronavirus to the United States. And she's joining Republican Senator Martha McSally of Arizona, and they seek to hold China legally and financially responsible for the spread of COVID-19. She says, the pandemic is worse because of their actions. I think we should quarantine China because of what they have done to the global economy, to the U.S., our economy, and our citizens. They knew they had the virus, they lied about it, they withheld information, they were not transparent, and they tried to blame it on the U.S. military. Now that, of course, did happen. They did attempt to blame it on the U.S. military, which, of course, is ridiculous, is blaming China specifically for the virus itself. They said passing that to send China this message that we know what they did and why. Of course, there's a conspiracy about this originating in a Chinese lab that has absolutely no evidence, it's verifiable, to back it up. Nonetheless, she says, it is vitally important that we send this message through this bill. So now, instead of focusing on what's best for the country, increased testing, financial help for the American worker, she instead wants to focus primarily on attacking China. Now, she argues that in the bill, the Chinese government should cancel trillions of dollars of debt owed by the U.S. to China for, of course, what we have spent on basically propping up American corporations, and seeks to give American citizens right of action to sue the Chinese government in federal court. I'm not sure how exactly that would be enforced, but instead of paying for healthcare, giving people a UBI until this is over, Marsha Blackburn would rather have you be able to sue the Chinese government in order to pay for your medical bills related to COVID-19. That is, of course, if you had contracted the virus and then survived it. What a way to pass the buck. I think it's a way to, of course, to get us to ignore the lack of Republican leadership and to make us focus on attacking another country. Country that, of course, has made plenty of their own mistakes when it comes to the virus. However, the Trump administration has also made plenty of their own mistakes that they continue to not own up to. They refuse to take adequate steps to protect the American citizenry. That, of course, has led to unnecessary death and unnecessary economic hardship. The government refuses to do what it was supposed to do, lead and ensure the safety of the people, and now we are set to reap the whirlwind. Some examples of the lack of leadership are these. Back in May of 2018, the Trump administration had disbanded the pandemic response team in the White House, saying that we didn't exactly need it. We don't see this happening. Not only was it a vestige, of course, of the Obama administration, but also something that they needed to get rid of so they could afford tax cuts for the rich. September, the Trump administration was presented with the Obama-ordered plans for a machine that was able to make 1.5 million N95 respirator masks a day during a pandemic. These were plans from the Obama administration because they had been told that a flu-like pandemic or an influenza-like pandemic could be possible, and so we need to protect ourselves just in case. Well, that machine was never funded, or was it built? In July, the CDC epidemiologist, position embedded in the Chinese Health Authority, had quit as the Trump administration announced that it will eliminate the post amid the trade war with China. That move comes as part of a hollowing out of the CDC's China presence from 47 staffers at the end of the Obama era, barely a dozen now. Of course, the staffers might have been able to alert us to a possible pandemic. At the same time, FEMA's National Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment for 2019 had already warned of a pandemic risk, modeling an influenza outbreak that led to a shortage of medical supplies, equipment, beds, and healthcare workers as hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. That, of course, was ignored. So maybe if there were people still left in China at the CDC, well, they probably would have been ignored as well. Late August, contract dispute leaves a federal stockpile of ventilators, well, any sort of maintenance. Of course, that goes against what President Trump had claimed, that there were people waiting next to the ventilators, literally, in order to have them get shipped out and used as soon as possible. They did not. In fact, these ventilators were broken. And that started in late August through January when this equipment was later distributed. And again, many of the ventilators received by these states, New York, for example, ended up not being usable. On September 30th, the Trump administration ended the funding for PREDICT, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, initiative to support laboratories abroad, including the one in Wuhan, China, to be vigilant for viruses with pandemic potential. Wuhan, of course, is considered to be the focal point, the beginning of this coronavirus. In October, confidential HHS draft report on Crimson Contagion documents found that currently there are insufficient funding sources designated for the federal government to use in response to a severe influenza pandemic. It warned the U.S. lacks domestic manufacturing capacity for the production of sufficient quantities of personal protective equipment, and that domestic supplies of on-hand stock of N95 respirators, ventilators, and other ancillary medical supplies are limited, difficult to restock, because they are often manufactured overseas. These failures, and many of others by the current administration to heed the words and warnings, then, when the virus began spreading around China and then to the world, they downplayed them, had played a very large role in the current crisis. Yet Senator Blackburn ignores America's failures and decides to blame it all on the Chinese, even when a part of her bill actually kind of makes a little bit of sense. But it's not an accident, it's a deflection at best, and even perhaps playing into some of Donald Trump's racism. Members of the Trump administration had received memos, for example, if they were to talk about China, they're to refer to it as the Chinese Communist Government. Now, China Communist Government? Yes, they do have a communist government. That is true. However, when speaking about China early on, whenever, of course, they do something favorable to the president, well, he doesn't refer to them as the Chinese Communist government or the Chinese Communist Party. He refers to them as China's government or Mr. Xi. That, of course, is intentional to make you remember that, yes, communists, bad, China, bad. Now, as I mentioned, there's one part of that bill that in some way makes a little bit of sense. And that, of course, was addressed in our readiness. The fact that we do have a lot of our manufacturing abroad made us very unprepared to manufacture the things necessary for saving lives. Masks for medical professionals, and of course, ventilators for hospitals. Now, thing is, that is not the fault of the Chinese. That's the fault of the manufacturers for using cheap, easily exploited labor in China. Blackburn, however, said, quote, "When you look at our supply chain, whether it's pharmaceuticals, technology, telecommunications, or PPE, most of what has been manufactured in China. That limits our access. What we need to do is bring that manufacturing back stateside. There will be incentives, but it's also the time for regulatory relief." Now, part of that sounds sensible, of course. You should have, yes, more of our manufacturing be at home. That makes a lot of sense. However, there are also parts that are very problematic. For one, regulatory reform, which is Republicans speak for more deregulation. Now, if you look at the manufacturing base in China, in areas where they're heavy in industry, you notice a couple of things: lack of regulation and pollution. So one of the things that Marsha Blackburn is calling for an increase of, yes, we should bring our companies back home, but we should make it cheaper and easier to exploit not only our lands, but also labor, so that these companies won't have to pay a living wage, won't have to adhere to quote unquote onerous standards when it comes to the environment, and so they can operate as much well here as they could in China, making them not want to go to China because they can make much more profit here. That is, of course, very problematic. Again, one thing you notice if you go to China, their industrial sector, is they deal with massive pollution, smog in those industrial sectors. Blackburn, of course, opposes legislation to stop that actively and actively denies climate change. And now she's saying we should probably take advantage of the now over 30 million people that are out of work in America. We should bring back those jobs at much, much lower pay. So understand that even in the end, even when they have a decent idea, it will always be tainted with things that are anti-worker because they themselves are anti-worker. No, this entire thing, of course, is red meat to Trump's base. They enjoy blaming China for essentially everything. China, of course, has issues. Permanent trade relations with China, for example, is weighted heavily in favor of domestic manufacturers leaving and exploiting Chinese workers for low wages and no benefits. We need to address that imbalance in trade and ensure that workers are protected no matter what country they work in, and to ensure that these companies, if they want to participate in American democracy, get bailed out, then they may have to ensure that they do manufacture in America and base their jobs here. Nothing in this bill does any of that. Instead, it shifts the blame from our government and the reactions to a pandemic that could have originated in any country other than China, or could have even originated here. Shifts that blame for the reaction to that virus away from our government and their many failures to someone else, anyone else. That's what this is all about, and that's why this is nothing more than a petty deflection. All All right. That's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you for going around the nation with me. Please like and share the stream if you haven't already. Please support us on Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation. That, of course, makes this show possible, as well as the weekend show. Here's the thing. So thank you guys. Like and share. Love you. And remember, change begins with you. Good night, nation. We'll see you guys later.
Mike Pounds.
Wait. You're getting nervous, man.
Please clap. You're kicking me out the door. You're kicking me out the door.